Good morning. Welcome to this talk exploring the conservation value of captive-bred lions, which is, we will see that it's about understanding the associated conflict about this topic. I'm Tina Hiller. I'm a conservation scientist with a diverse background in economics, in coaching psychology, and in conservation biology. And I have a keen interest in the social sciences within conservation, and especially in conservation conflict. So in my presentation today, I will share with you what I learned during the research I conducted for my master's in conservation biology through the University of Kent and the Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology. All right, let's get started. Here I give you a brief overview of the research project before I then dive into the results. During my conservation biology studies, that was in 2018-2019, the controversy about the trade in captive lion parts was at a peak, and the polarized debate focused a lot on the question if these lions have any conservation value or not. So I wanted to shed light on the situation and to understand what is missing or what is hampering any solutions from a social science perspective. And initially, I discovered through a literature review that there is generally no clear definition for what conservation value means. And in addition, that to determine any conservation value, you need a framework with clear and agreed criteria. And that was clearly not the case and still is not the case for captive-bred lions. So therefore, as my research aim, I decided to explore the conservation attitude of lion breeders and their viewpoints about the conservation value of their lions, and then compare those perspectives with the ones from scientific experts and policymakers. And for my analysis, I worked with qualitative data that I collected in 28 semi-structured interviews, and then I used an inductive research approach to analyze the data. As you can see in the table here, I spoke with various active members of the captive lion sector, as well as scientists or policymakers and other key informants. And on the left-hand side, you can also see that with all the interviews, I got to see quite a lot of South Africa. Well, and this is now what my exploration revealed. In this depiction, I summarized the emergent theory from my data analysis. It shows all the central elements and the interrelations which are responsible for the contentious viewpoints about the conservation value of captive-bred lions. And in the center, in this bubble, you can see that I found a wide spectrum for the appraisals of this conservation value. And that was the case even though the interviewees shared a lot of common ground about the human-induced threats to wild lions and what successful conservation would look like, and even they spoke about 8 criteria overall when they argued either for or against the conservation value of these lions. But still, there were large discrepancies in the evaluations of this conservation value, and people used 2 lion-related mechanisms to argue for their viewpoint, and that's what I called the lion frame in the middle. Because people then spoke about the lions, and either they referred to the uncertainty about what will happen to lions in the wild in the next 50 or 100 years, or they referred to the ambiguous knowledge about links between wild and captive lions, and that served to support their arguments. However, and that is depicted in this outer frame, it turned out that people actually translated their personal values and their related opinions about breeders of lions, and also their worldview about what is the right way to achieve conservation into their conservation value appraisals. And that's what you see in this outer frame. So before I speak more about this outer frame, which was very interesting from the social science perspective, let me still summarize the inner frame based on these conservation value criteria that emerged through this study. So this is now about the inner, the lion frame of assessing the conservation value of captive bred lions. The interviews revealed 8 different criteria that can be used for this evaluation, and also the appraisal spectrum reaching from no, captive bred lions don't have any conservation value to yes, of course they do. As you can see by looking at the numbers in the brackets, most people spoke about genetics, reintroductions, or that captive bred lions serve as a buffer to shield wild lions from commercial activities, and that they represent a safety net population for an uncertain future. But habitat protection, especially on hunting properties, research opportunities, or raising conservation awareness and funds for conservation, they also featured during the interviews as criteria. And then the conservation spectrum ranged from, as I said, the no conservation value over to potential conservation value, so they could have, maybe, to they have, but it's limited. And finally, yes, they have existing conservation value. And remember, people use 2 mechanisms to substantiate their viewpoint. The one was the uncertainty about the future of lion populations in different regions of Africa. And that mechanism was often used for the safety net or the research and the raising conservation awareness criteria. The extremes, they ranged from no conservation value because, conservation of wild lions will be successful, and in any case, lions are prolific breeders and they will recover quickly, and so, we don't need them. And the other viewpoint for conservation value was we can expect an exponentially growing human population in Africa. We will have, therefore, more human-induced threats to lions, and we will need the captive bred lions to ensure the long-term existence of lions. And then let me also give you an example for the second mechanism, the knowledge ambiguity. So, for example, for the genetics criterion, because there's a lack of knowledge of the genetics of captive bred lions, and also vague understanding of what does the right genetics, what would that look like, people chose what they believe to argue for either yes or no for their appraisal of the conservation value. But as I already said, it turned actually out that people linked or translated their personal values and their worldviews on conservation into these conservation value appraisals. Let us first look at the diverging views about the right way to conserve biodiversity. So I had interviews on the left-hand side arguing for the sustainable use paradigm. They said that socioeconomic factors are the biggest factors responsible for the success or the failure of conservation, and that since the South African wildlife economy gives wild animals a monetary value, they are protected because there's an incentive to protect them, and therefore, conservation, the end, pays for itself. And on the other side of the spectrum, people argued that humans, especially, because they come in large numbers and they have high levels of consumption, they are incompatible with conservation, and that therefore, we need wilderness without humans, and that protection has to be paid for by taxpayers or by donors. So as you can imagine, the people with the sustainable use understanding, they assess the conservation value higher than those with the wilderness protection paradigm. But there was also a third group, the neither nor, who argued that both ways of conserving don't work because, the sustainable use encourages a focus on profitability, the single bottom line, and incentivizes intensive breeding, and that reduces conservation outcomes. And the wilderness protection paradigm leads to a situation where people that are not living with the wildlife, they demand pristine wilderness without bearing the costs. So interviews in this group typically rated the conservation value of captive bred lions as either potential or limited. And now finally, people also translated their personal values firstly into a judgment about lion breeders, and from there into their conservation value appraisal. On this slide, you can see the value iceberg responsible for this phenomenon, and let's start above the surface. This is where the conflict and the mistrust happens between people who on the one side describe lion owners as greedy and only interested in their personal enrichment, and those on the other side who view breeders as respectable entrepreneurs. And this polarized debate is typical for what is called a taboo trade-off. It always manifests when sacred values are compared to secular monetary valuations of scarce resources, and it then serves as a breeding ground for mistrust and the escalating emotions that we see. In particular, we found that people in the middle, they qualified breeders as dodgy people with a skewed understanding of conservation, and they were skeptical about the conservation value of captive bred lions. On the far right, in turn, people judged lion breeders even more harshly as bad people, with a general notion that all captive lion facilities must be shut down and that these lions don't have any conservation value. What is important to note is that based on these judgments, any knowledge-based framework to assess the conservation value of captive bred lions will have no chance of being accepted by all relevant stakeholders, and that the conflict will only further escalate no matter how much scientific knowledge is developed. However, if you then start looking below the surface of the iceberg, a range of personal values emerged. And it's important to note that these core values cannot be changed for conservation purposes. But if you look at all these values, most of them is what is called self-transcendent. Like, for example, taking responsibility for animals and nature, or maintaining natural order, or caring for the welfare of animals. So these self-transcending personal values are all principally compatible, and the only exception is the value on the left to achieve top quality, as this is a self-enhancing and not a self-transcending value. But nevertheless, even this value is desirable within societies. So if stakeholders manage to engage on these core values rather than the taboo trade-off above the surface, it would not be impossible to imagine and to appreciate that the different personal values with the potential to hopefully move away from the moralized debates about the breeders and their bad character, and hopefully enable some trust building as a prerequisite to prepare for a conservation value appraisal. So in conclusion, let me emphasize once more the importance of addressing conservation-related worldviews, and also to enable stakeholders to engage with each other about their personal values, because these two aspects really form prerequisites to be able to apply scientific knowledge in a polarized conflict situation. And in this case, it's a prerequisite to develop an appraisal framework for the conservation value of captive bred lions that is then accepted by all relevant stakeholders. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.